On the night her family threw a lavish party to celebrate selling the family farm out from under her, the woman they had spent 9 long years calling a freeloader walked quietly through the door holding nothing but 3 pieces of paper. The first piece of paper proved that she, and not her golden boy brother, was the sole legal owner of every single acre of that land. The second piece of paper proved that he had forged their dying mother's signature in order to steal it. And the third was a video of their mother, recorded only weeks before she passed, calmly naming exactly what each of her children had done to her in her final months. For 9 years they had called Maggie the failure, the spinster who threw her life away, the leech who lived off their mother. Not one of them ever imagined that the quiet woman scrubbing their mother's floors and changing her sheets was worth more than all of them combined. And not one of them ever imagined that she had kept every single receipt. Before I begin, let me ask you something, and I would truly love to hear your answer. In your family, who was the quiet one? The one who stayed behind, who did the caring, who never got the credit while the loud ones took the praise? Drop it down in the comments and tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. I read every one of them. And if you have ever watched someone be judged for the plain, ordinary skin they wore, while the sweetness inside them went completely unnoticed, then stay with me, because that is exactly the kind of story this is. Hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the moment everything turns. And believe me, it turns. My name is Noyette. This morning, before the sun climbed high enough to scorch the soil, I carried my basket out to the far corner of my orchard, to the old Sapodilla trees my grandmother planted long before I was born. If you have never seen a Sapodilla, a hongxiam, let me describe it to you. It is not a fruit that announces itself. It is small and round, and its skin is a dull, sandy brown, rough and freckled and plain. It is, if I am being honest with you, a homely-looking thing. It hides at the back of the market while the bright mangoes and the glossy red apples sit up front, catching every eye. People walk right past the Sapodilla. They do not understand it. And here is the secret the impatient never learn. If you pluck a Sapodilla too early, while it is still firm and green inside, and you bite into it in a hurry, it will punish you. The unripe flesh is hard and chalky, and it floods your mouth with a bitter, puckering sting that grips your tongue and will not let go. Most people who taste that once throw the fruit into the dirt and swear they will never touch it again. They decide, in that single bitter second, that they know exactly what a Sapodilla is. And they are completely wrong. Because the Sapodilla cannot be rushed. You have to gather it gently, and you have to wait. You set it aside in a warm, quiet place, and you give it time, and you do not judge it by its rough brown skin. And then one day you press it softly with your thumb, and it gives, and you peel it open. And inside that plain, ugly little fruit is a flesh the color of warm honey, soft as melted sugar, sweeter than almost anything that grows on this earth. It tastes of brown sugar and malt and caramel, of patience rewarded. The people who threw it away in disgust never once tasted that. They never knew what they were holding. They never knew what they had thrown into the dirt. I thought about those rough brown Sapodillas this morning, my friends, because the story I want to tell you is about a woman exactly like that fruit. Her own family looked at her plain skin, at her quiet life and her dirt-stained hands, and they decided in a single bitter second that they knew everything about her. They decided she was worthless. They bit down too early, they tasted nothing but their own impatience, and they threw her away. They never waited. They never wondered what was ripening, quiet and patient, just beneath the surface. And so they never had any idea how sweet, and how strong, she truly was. So let me tell you about the day the whole family finally found out. Her name was Margaret Hayes, though everyone who loved her, which was a smaller number than it should have been, simply called her Maggie. She was 43 years old. And for 9 years, she had been the one who stayed. The Hayes orchard sat on 180 acres at the green edge of a small town called Millbrook, a town that had once been all farmland and was now slowly, hungrily being swallowed by the city creeping toward it from the south. The farmhouse was old and white and a little crooked, the kind of house that holds a century of a family inside its walls. Maggie's grandfather had cleared that land. Her father, Walter, had worked it until the day his heart gave out in the North Field, 9 years ago, leaving behind a widow named Ruth and a farm that was far too much for one aging woman to manage alone. Maggie had 2 older siblings. Her brother, Gregory, who insisted on being called Greg, was 49. He was the golden child, the one their mother had bragged about at church and the grocery store and every holiday for as long as anyone could remember. Greg had moved to the city decades ago and called himself a property developer. He wore tailored suits and drove a leased German sedan and spoke in the smooth, confident cadence of a man who has never once doubted that he deserves more than he has. Her sister, Vivian, was 46. Vivian was an interior designer, or so her business cards claimed, a woman who furnished other people's lives with expensive taste and floated through Millbrook's small social scene as though she were royalty visiting the peasants. Between the two of them, Greg and Vivian had spent their entire adult lives building a glittering image of success. And then there was Maggie, the youngest, the quiet one. When their father died and their mother began to fail, it was not Greg who came home, and it was not Vivian. It was Maggie. She packed up her apartment in the city, she gave up the life she had been building, and she moved back into her childhood bedroom in that crooked white farmhouse to take care of the woman who had given her life. She did it without being asked, and she did it without complaint. And for that, her family decided she was a failure. The logic of it was breathtaking, if you stopped to think about it. Greg and Vivian had abandoned their mother, and they were celebrated for their independence and their ambition. Maggie had devoted nearly a decade of her life to caring for that same mother, and she was mocked for having no life of her own. At every family gathering, the story was always the same. Greg would hold court, talking about his deals and his developments. Vivian would describe her latest client, some wealthy family across the county. And eventually, inevitably, one of them would glance at Maggie with a thin, pitying smile and say something like, "Well, somebody has to look after Mom, and bless Maggie, she was never really going to amount to much anyway." They said it as though her care were a consolation prize. As though love were what you did when you had failed at everything else. What none of them knew, what not a single member of that family had ever bothered to find out, was what Maggie did during the long, quiet hours after her mother fell asleep each night. 9 years ago, when Maggie first came home, money had been desperately tight. The farm was bleeding cash, her mother's pension barely covered the medications, and Maggie needed a way to keep them both afloat without leaving Ruth's side. So she had started small. Her mother kept a recipe, an old family recipe for apple butter and spiced preserves, made from the fruit of the very orchard Maggie now tended. One autumn, almost as a lark, Maggie made a few dozen jars, photographed them on the kitchen table, and listed them for sale online under a plain little label she designed herself. She called the brand Goldenrod Provisions, after the wildflowers that grew along the orchard fence. They sold out in a weekend. So she made more. And those sold out too. Over the following years, while her family was busy not noticing her, Maggie built something. She used the quiet nighttime hours to fill orders, to refine her recipes, to learn the business one careful step at a time. Goldenrod Provisions grew from a kitchen table into a small workshop in the old barn. And then into a brand carried by specialty grocers in 3 states. And then into a company that shipped its honey sweet preserves and small batch farm goods to customers all across the country. Maggie, who understood from watching her siblings exactly how ugly people became when they smelled money, kept her ownership hidden behind a quiet holding company she named Orchard Lane Holdings. She let the world believe Goldenrod was run by some faceless corporation. She let her own family believe she was broke. By the time this story truly begins, Goldenrod Provisions was worth somewhere north of $11 million, and Maggie Hayes, the freeloader, the failure, the spinster who had wasted her life, was personally wealthier than her golden brother and her glittering sister put together, several times over. She drove a 15-year-old pickup truck. She wore her father's old flannel shirts to work in the orchard. She had every reason in the world to walk away from her sneering family and never look back. And she had stayed anyway, for 9 years, for one simple reason that none of them could have ever understood. She stayed because she loved her mother. To Maggie, that was not a consolation prize. That was the whole point of a life. Ruth Hayes died on a cold Tuesday morning in late October, with her youngest daughter holding her hand. She was 74 years old. And in the final months of her life, something had happened in that crooked white farmhouse, something quiet and cruel, that Maggie had been carefully, meticulously documenting for a long time. It had started about 3 years before Ruth passed, when Maggie first noticed the money. As her mother's health declined, Maggie had become Ruth's power of attorney for medical decisions, and she helped manage the household accounts. She was, by nature and by the trade she had quietly mastered, a woman who paid attention to numbers. And the numbers in her mother's savings account had begun, slowly and steadily, to drain away. At first Maggie assumed it was the medical bills, the mounting cost of caring for a dying woman. But when she pulled the statements and traced the transfers, the truth was something else entirely. Money was leaving Ruth's account in regular, deliberate withdrawals, routed to an account Maggie did not recognize. She ran the details the way she had learned to run the details of her own business, and the account traced back to a shell company. And the name attached to that shell company was her brother, Gregory Hayes. Greg had convinced their mother, in her frailest and most confused moments, to sign a financial power of attorney granting him control over her assets. He had told her it was to help with the bills, to take the burden off poor overworked Maggie. Ruth, who had spent her whole life believing the sun rose and set on her golden sun, had signed it. And Greg had used it to quietly bleed his dying mother dry. Over 3 years, the withdrawals added up to more than $240,000. Vivian, Maggie would later learn, had known about every dollar of it, and had taken her share. A cold, still clarity had settled over Maggie the night she traced that money. She did not call her brother screaming. She did not confront her sister in tears. She did exactly what the patient, quiet part of her had always done. She began to gather the fruit, and she set it aside, and she waited. She printed the statements. She saved the records. She built a file. And she began, very quietly, to make some calls of her own. Then, 4 months before Ruth died, Maggie found the second thing. And the second thing was so much worse than the first. She had gone into town to pick up her mother's prescriptions, and on the way home she stopped at the county recorder's office to handle a small matter regarding the orchard's water rights. While she was there, almost by accident, a clerk mentioned a recent filing against the Hayes property. Maggie asked to see it. And there, recorded against the 180 acres her grandfather had cleared with his own hands, was a $600,000 line of credit. A loan. Taken out against the farm that was the only thing her mother had left in this world. Maggie stared at the document, and at the bottom of it, she saw her mother's signature. Except it was not her mother's signature. Maggie knew her mother's hand better than she knew her own. Ruth had suffered a small stroke 2 years earlier, and since then her signature had become a fragile, trembling thing that wandered and shook across the page. The signature on this loan document was smooth, confident, steady. It had been written by someone whose hand did not shake at all. It had been written, Maggie understood with a chill that started at the base of her spine, by her brother. Greg was drowning. Behind the tailored suits and the leased German car, his glittering development empire was a house of cards collapsing in slow motion, buried under debt he could not service. And so he had reached into the last thing his family owned, the farm, the home, his own mother's final security, and he had forged her name to strip the value out of it. He was burning down his mother's house to keep himself warm. And he had no idea at all, that his quiet, plain, freeloading little sister had just walked into the county recorder's office and found the smoking gun. That cold afternoon, standing at the counter with the forged loan document trembling slightly in her steady hands, Maggie Hayes made a decision. She was not going to let them get away with it. Not with the money. Not with the farm. And not with whatever they were planning to do next. She did not yet know the half of what they were planning. But she was about to find out. And when she did, the patient, sweet, underestimated woman they had thrown away was going to ripen into something none of them had ever dreamed she could be. The morning after she found the forged loan, Maggie drove 40 minutes to the next county, to a quiet law office that had nothing to do with Millbrook and nothing to do with her family. She had chosen it carefully. She walked in carrying a plain accordion folder, and she walked out having retained one of the most respected estate attorneys in the state, a woman named Eleanor Cho. Eleanor was perhaps 60, small and precise, with silver-streaked hair pulled back into a severe knot and a pair of reading glasses she peered over when she wanted to make a point. She had spent 30 years untangling the financial crimes that families commit against one another, and very little surprised her anymore. But when Maggie laid out the documents across her desk, the bank statements, the shell company, the forged loan with that smooth, steady, lying signature, even Eleanor Cho went quiet for a long moment. "This is not a family squabble," Eleanor said at last, removing her glasses. "This is elder financial abuse. The forged signature on a federally regulated loan document is bank fraud and forgery, both serious felonies. The power of attorney your brother used to drain your mother's accounts may itself have been obtained through undue influence, which would make every dollar he took recoverable, and criminal." She looked up at Maggie with sharp, appraising eyes. "Mrs. Hayes, I have to ask you something directly. What is it that you actually want? Some clients want money. Some want revenge. Some want it all to quietly go away. Tell me which one you are, so I know how to fight for you." Maggie thought about the question for a long time before she answered. "I want my mother to be safe for whatever time she has left," she said finally. "I want the people who did this to lose every single thing they tried to steal. And I want it to happen in front of everyone, so that no one in that town ever again gets to call me the failure while they call him a good son. But more than any of that," she said, her voice steady, "I want my mother to know that someone loved her for her, and not for what they could take from her. Can you help me do that?" Eleanor Cho put her glasses back on. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, a thin, dangerous smile touching the corner of her mouth, "I think you and I are going to work very well together." Over the following weeks, with Eleanor's guidance, the full shape of the betrayal came into focus, and it was uglier than Maggie had imagined. The $240,000 Greg had siphoned through the shell company was only the beginning. Vivian, it turned out, had received regular transfers from that same account, payments she had laughingly described to friends as her mother finally helping out the way a mother should. The $600,000 forged loan against the farm had already been partially spent, poured into the cracks of Greg's collapsing development business to keep his creditors at bay for a few more desperate months. And then Eleanor's investigator found the last piece, the piece that turned Maggie's cold patience into something closer to ice. Greg had signed a letter of intent with a company called Ridgeline Development. Ridgeline had been circling the green edges of Millbrook for years, buying up old farms and turning them into identical beige subdivisions. They wanted the Hayes Orchard, all 180 acres of it, and they had offered $4.2 million for the land. Greg had agreed to sell. He had signed the letter of intent as the authorized representative of the property owner. And once again, at the bottom of that document, was Ruth Hayes's signature, smooth and steady and false. Greg intended to wait until their mother passed, produce a will that gave him control, and close the sale before anyone could blink. He was going to sell the family land, the orchard, the crooked white house, his own mother's grave-to-be, and pocket the millions to save himself from the consequences of his own greed. But to make all of that work, Greg needed one more thing. He needed a will. The farm and what remained of Ruth's estate had to legally pass to him, or at least to him and Vivian, before he could sell. And so, about 2 months before Ruth died, while Maggie was away for 2 days at a food expo she had told her family was a temporary job, Greg and Vivian made their move. They came to the farmhouse with a man Maggie had never met, a notary Greg had found who asked no questions. They sat there confused, medicated, grieving mother down at the kitchen table, and they put a document in front of her, and they guided her trembling hand, and they had her sign a new will. A will that left the entire estate to be divided equally between Gregory and Vivian. A will that mentioned Margaret Hayes exactly once, in a single cold sentence, stating that the youngest daughter had already received sufficient support during her years living in the family home and was to inherit nothing further. They had not just planned to rob her. They had reached into their dying mother's hand and used it to erase her. When Maggie returned home and learned what they had done, she did not let them see a single crack in her composure. She smiled, she thanked them for helping with Mom while she was gone, and she went up to her room and closed the door. And then she called Eleanor Cho. What happened next was the quietest and most important work Maggie had ever done. On a clear, good morning, one of Ruth's better days, when the fog of her medication had lifted and her eyes were sharp and present, Eleanor Cho came to the farmhouse, along with Ruth's longtime physician, Dr. Abernathy, and Ruth's home health nurse, a kind, fierce woman named Rosa Mendez who had cared for Ruth for 2 years and had seen, with her own eyes, the way Greg and Vivian treated their mother. Maggie sat beside her mother and gently, carefully, told her the truth. She showed her the bank statements. She showed her the forged loan. She showed her the will they had guided her hand to sign. Ruth Hayes was an old woman, and a frail one, but she was not, on that morning, a confused one. She read the documents slowly, and as she understood what her son and her elder daughter had done to her, her face did not crumple into tears. It hardened into something Maggie had not seen in her mother in years. It hardened into resolve. "They think I am already gone," Ruth said quietly. "They are spending my life before I have finished living it." She reached across the table and took Maggie's hand, her grip thin but absolutely certain. "Not one more day," she said. "Not one more dollar." Dr. Abernathy examined Ruth that morning and signed a formal letter, dated and witnessed, attesting that Ruth Hayes was of completely sound mind and fully competent to manage her own affairs. And then, with Eleanor Cho guiding her and Rosa Mendez and Dr. Abernathy serving as independent witnesses, Ruth Hayes executed a new will and a revocable living trust. The new will explicitly revoked every prior will, including the one Greg and Vivian had forced upon her. It placed the entire estate, the 180 acres, the crooked white farmhouse, and all of Ruth's remaining assets, into a trust. And it named one person as the sole heir, the sole executor, and the sole trustee of everything. Margaret Hayes. The youngest daughter. The one who stayed. And then Ruth asked for one more thing. She asked Maggie to set up a camera. The video was not long, only about 11 minutes. In it, Ruth Hayes sat in her own kitchen, in the warm morning light, lucid and calm, and she spoke directly to the lens. She stated the date. She stated her name and confirmed that she was speaking of her own free will, with no one coaching her. And then, in a steady voice, she described exactly what her son Gregory and her daughter Vivian had done to her. The power of attorney they had tricked her into signing. The money they had taken. The loan against her home that she had never agreed to and never signed. The will they had guided her trembling hand to sign while her youngest daughter was away. She named it all, plainly, without anger, the way you might describe a long, slow illness. And then, at the end, she looked into the camera and she spoke about Maggie. My daughter Margaret gave up 9 years of her life to take care of me, Ruth said, her eyes shining but her voice never breaking. She asked for nothing. She never once complained. The others called her a failure to my face, and God forgive me, for too many years I let them, because I was a foolish old woman who could not see past the noise of my loud children to the quiet love of the one who actually stayed. Everything I have, I leave to Maggie. Not because she needs it. She does not need a penny of it, and one day you will all understand exactly what I mean by that. I leave it to her because she is the only one of my children who ever loved me as a person, and not as a bank. The rest of you, she said, you reaped exactly what you sowed. When the camera stopped, Ruth was tired, but she was smiling. Now, she said, taking her daughter's hand again. Now let them celebrate. The sweetness, she said, will keep. Ruth Hayes lived another 6 weeks. They were, in their strange way, some of the most peaceful weeks Maggie could remember. The secret was set. The trap was laid. And freed from the fear of what her other children might do, Ruth seemed to settle into a quiet contentment. She and Maggie sat on the porch in the cold autumn afternoons, looking out over the orchard, and Ruth told her stories about Walter, about the early years on the farm. About the grandmother who had planted the Sapodilla trees and the apple trees and taught her the preserve recipe that had, unbeknownst to almost everyone, quietly made her youngest daughter a wealthy woman. Greg and Vivian visited exactly twice in those 6 weeks, brief, performative visits during which they checked their phones and asked, with poorly disguised impatience, how their mother was holding up. Ruth was unfailingly warm to them. She had decided, she told Maggie, that there was no reason to tip her hand. Let them think they had won. The harvest, after all, would come in its own time. Ruth died on a cold Tuesday morning in late October, with her youngest daughter holding her hand and the first frost silvering the orchard outside the window. Her last words were simple. She squeezed Maggie's fingers and said, "You were always the sweet one." And then she was gone. Maggie grieved. She grieved honestly and deeply, in a way that her brother and sister, occupied with their plans, did not. But even in her grief, she did not forget what was coming. And she did not have to wait long. The funeral was barely over before Greg and Vivian made their move. They had been waiting 9 years for this, and they descended on the farmhouse like a pair of crows on a fallen lamb. 3 days after they buried their mother, Maggie came back from a meeting with Eleanor Cho to find the locks on the farmhouse had been changed. A handwritten note was taped to the door, in Vivian's looping designer handwriting. Maggie, it read, in the interest of the estate, we've secured the property. Greg is handling everything now per Mom's will. We'll let you know when you can collect your personal items. It's time you stood on your own 2 feet. Maggie stood on the porch of the house she had lived in for 9 years, the house she now legally owned, and read the note that locked her out of it, and she felt the last thread of anything she still owed these people quietly snap. Inside, she would later learn, they had already begun. They had produced the forged will at the office of a lawyer Greg kept on retainer, and filed it with the county. They were already clearing out Ruth's belongings, dividing the antiques and the silver between them, holding up their mother's wedding china to the light and discussing what it might fetch. And Greg, flush with the confidence of a man who believes he holds every card, had begun planning the centerpiece of his triumph. He was going to throw a party. He called it a celebration of life. He booked the restored Grand Barn at the old Whitfield estate, the most prestigious event venue in the county. He hired a caterer and a string quartet. He invited all of Millbrook, the mayor, the bankers, the country club set, everyone whose good opinion he had spent his life chasing. And he invited Ridgeline Development, because the true purpose of the evening, beneath the flowers and the eulogies, was for Greg Hayes to stand up in front of the entire town and announce that he, the devoted son, was honoring his mother's legacy by selling the family farm and using the proceeds to establish the Hayes Family Foundation, with himself, naturally, as its director. It was to be his coronation. The moment the golden boy finally collected everything he believed he was owed. That evening, Maggie sat in the cab of her old pickup truck at the edge of the orchard, watching the sun go down behind the Sapodilla trees, and her phone rang. It was Eleanor Cho. "They've filed it," Eleanor said. "The forged will. They've petitioned the court to make Greg the executor. And our investigator confirms the Ridgeline closing is scheduled for the Monday after this party of his." Eleanor paused. "Maggie, they think they have won. They think it is over. We can file our will and our evidence with the court first thing tomorrow morning, quietly, through the proper channels. It would stop them cold. It is, I will tell you honestly, the safe and sensible way to do this." Maggie looked out at the trees her grandmother had planted, at the small, plain, rough brown fruit hanging patient and unseen among the leaves, ripening in its own quiet time. "No," she said softly. "Not yet, Eleanor. Let them have their celebration first. Let him stand up in front of the whole town and announce it. Let them pour the champagne." She started the truck, and the old engine rumbled to life in the gathering dark. "A Sapodilla is no good until it's ready," she said. "And it's almost ready. Then we serve it to everyone at once." In the days leading up to Greg's grand celebration, the family treated Maggie with a cruelty that had finally stopped bothering to disguise itself. With their mother gone and the will, as far as they knew, firmly in their favor, Greg and Vivian no longer saw any reason to perform even the thin courtesy they had once managed. Maggie was given a single afternoon to collect her belongings from the farmhouse, supervised, as though she were a suspected thief in her own home. Vivian stood in the doorway of the bedroom Maggie had slept in for 9 years, arms crossed, watching her pack a life into cardboard boxes, and offered a running commentary dressed up as concern. "You know, Maggie," Vivian said, examining her own manicure, "this is really for the best. You've been hiding out here playing nursemaid for nearly a decade. It wasn't healthy. A woman your age, no career, no husband, no prospects. She tilted her head with a pity so theatrical it was almost a performance art. Greg and I were talking, and we want to help you land on your feet. She reached into her designer handbag and produced a folded brochure, holding it out between two fingers as though it might soil her. It's a placement agency in the city, she said. They specialize in domestic positions. Housekeeping, elder companions, that sort of thing. It's really the only thing you're qualified for at this point, and honestly, you're good at it. There's no shame in knowing your place. Maggie looked at the brochure for a long moment. Then she took it, and she smiled, and she said, "Thank you, Vivian. That's so thoughtful." And she slipped it into her pocket, the same way Pearl Turner might have, to put exactly where it belonged later. Greg's contempt was colder and more efficient than his sister's. He did not bother with brochures. When Maggie passed him in the front hall on her way out, carrying the last of her boxes, he was on the phone with someone from Ridgeline. And he covered the receiver just long enough to say, "The cleanup crew comes Thursday, so make sure you've got everything by then. We're not storing your junk." Then he uncovered the phone and went back to discussing the closing, as though his sister were a piece of furniture being hauled to the curb. He had no idea that the woman he was speaking to like dirt held, in a fireproof box in the cab of her truck, the power to take everything he had ever pretended to be. There was one moment, in those bitter days, that did not taste of bitterness. As Maggie was loading her truck for the last time, her niece Lily appeared at the end of the driveway. Lily was Greg's daughter, 19 years old, home from her first year of college, and she had always been the one bright, decent thread in the tangle of that family. She had spent summers at the orchard as a child, and she loved her Aunt Maggie with the uncomplicated loyalty of someone who had not yet learned to measure people by their bank accounts. Lily hugged her aunt fiercely, and when she pulled back, her eyes were wet. "I heard what they're doing," Lily whispered. "Dad and Aunt Vivian. I heard them talking about the money, and the loan, and selling the orchard. Aunt Maggie, it's wrong. Grandma loved this place. You love this place. It isn't right and I don't know how to stop them." Maggie held her niece's face in her hands. "You don't have to stop them, sweetheart," she said gently. "You just have to remember, when everything happens, that you were the one person in this family who said it was wrong out loud. That matters more than you know." And then she did something that surprised the girl. She said, "Will you come to the celebration on Saturday? Sit near the front. Whatever happens, I want you there." Lily, confused but trusting, nodded. That was the thing about Maggie's apparent surrender. It was a performance every bit as deliberate as Greg's. She let them lock her out. She let them mock her. She let them believe she had crawled away defeated, because a defeated, broken woman was exactly what they needed to see in order to walk confidently into the trap she was building. If they had sensed even for a moment that she was fighting back, Greg might have grown cautious. He might have postponed the party, quietly closed the Ridgeline sale in some back office, and made the whole thing far harder to undo. So Maggie gave him no reason for caution. She gave him the gift of his own arrogance. She let him plan his coronation in peace. And while he planned, she worked. The week before the celebration, Maggie spent every waking hour with Eleanor Cho, in the quiet law office in the next county, assembling the harvest. Eleanor laid it out on the long conference table like a surgeon arranging her instruments. There was the real will, the one Ruth had signed of her own free will, witnessed and notarized and ironclad, revoking every prior version. There was the revocable living trust that placed the entire estate into Maggie's hands as trustee, recorded and dated months before Ruth's death. There was Dr. Abernathy's signed and witnessed letter, certifying that Ruth had been fully competent on the day she signed. There was the forged will Greg and Vivian had filed, sitting beside the real one, its smooth false signature looking more damning by the minute. There were the bank statements tracing $240,000 out of a dying woman's account and into a shell company controlled by her son. There were the records of the regular payments to Vivian. There was the forged $600,000 loan recorded against the farm. There was the forged Ridgeline letter of intent, agreeing to sell land that Greg did not own, with their mother's false signature at the bottom. There was Rosa Mendez's sworn affidavit, describing in plain, devastating detail the way she had personally watched Greg and Vivian treat their mother. And there was the video. The 11 minutes of Ruth Hayes, lucid and calm in her own kitchen, telling the world exactly what her children had done. "It is more than enough," Eleanor said, looking over the assembled evidence with grim satisfaction. "The forged loan alone is a felony. The forged sale of property he does not own is fraud against Ridgeline as well as against the estate. The systematic draining of your mother's accounts is felony elder financial exploitation in this state, and the dollar amounts make it a very serious one." She removed her glasses. "I have already prepared the filings to invalidate their will, to record your trust as the rightful owner of the property, and to formally place a hold on the Ridgeline transaction so that not one shovel of that orchard can be sold. The moment you give me the word, Maggie, these go to the court and copies go to the district attorney." Eleanor paused, and looked at her client over the rim of her glasses. "You understand that once this begins, there is no taking it back. Your brother and your sister will very likely face criminal prosecution. They could go to prison." Maggie was quiet for a moment, looking at the video paused on Eleanor's laptop screen, at the frozen image of her mother's kind, determined face. "They reached into my mother's hand while she was dying," Maggie said softly, "and they used it to erase me, and to sell the only thing she had left in the world." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I gave them 9 years of grace, Eleanor. I gave them every chance to simply be decent. They chose this." She looked up. "File everything Monday morning, the day after the celebration. But there is one part one I'm going to deliver myself. In person. On Saturday night." Eleanor Cho almost smiled. "The video," she said. Maggie nodded. "They are going to stand up in front of that entire town and tell them what wonderful children they were. And then my mother is going to tell that same town the truth, in her own words, with her own voice." She closed the laptop gently. "Let them set the stage," Maggie said. "I'll bring the harvest." She spent that Saturday afternoon alone in her small rented apartment in town, the apartment that was, of course, only a temporary thing, since she could have bought half the county if she had wanted to. She pressed her one good dress, a simple, dignified thing in deep charcoal, nothing that screamed for attention. She did not need to scream. She gathered the slim leather folder Eleanor had prepared for her, the one holding clean copies of the real will, the forged Ridgeline letter, and a single flash drive containing her mother's video. She placed it carefully on the passenger seat of her old pickup truck. And as the light began to fail and the time of the celebration drew near, Maggie Hayes drove out to the restored grand barn at the Whitfield estate, where the whole of Millbrook had gathered to watch the golden son receive his crown. They had spent 9 years deciding they knew exactly what she was. They had bitten down early and tasted only what they expected to taste. None of them had any idea what had been ripening, quiet and patient and sweet, just beneath the rough brown surface they had been so quick to throw away. The restored grand barn at the Whitfield estate had never looked finer. Hundreds of warm golden lights hung from the soaring timber rafters, and long tables draped in ivory linen ran the length of the polished wood floor. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Caterers in black aprons drifted through the crowd with silver trays of wine and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Nearly all of Millbrook had come, the mayor and the bankers and the country club set, the people whose admiration Greg Hayes had spent his entire life trying to purchase. And at the front of the room, beside the small wooden stage, stood a large, tasteful, framed portrait of Ruth Hayes on a draped easel. Her kind face smiling out over the gathering, her memory drafted, without her consent, to serve as the centerpiece of her own children's triumph. Greg moved through the room like a man at the peak of his life, shaking hands, accepting condolences that curdled seamlessly into congratulations. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than the monthly payment on the truck Maggie drove. His wife, Diane, glided beside him in a deep emerald dress, a heavy diamond bracelet catching the golden light at her wrist, accepting compliments on her strength during this difficult time. Vivian held court near the wine table, describing to a circle of admirers how she and her brother had selflessly managed everything, how exhausting it had all been, how their poor mother's affairs had been such a tangle. And in a quiet corner near the front, exactly where her aunt had asked her to sit, 19-year-old Lily Hayes sat alone, twisting a paper napkin into shreds, watching the door. Maggie arrived a little after the celebration had begun. She slipped in through the wide barn doors in her simple charcoal dress, carrying her slim leather folder, and for a moment no one noticed her at all. When they did, the reaction was a ripple of awkward, pitying glances. Someone directed her, gently, toward a small table at the very back of the room, near the kitchen doors, the table reserved for the people who did not quite matter. Maggie sat down without a word of protest. Diane drifted past and bent to murmur, "So glad you could make it, Maggie. It means a lot to Greg that you came to support him tonight." Maggie smiled and said nothing. She set her folder on the table, folded her hands on top of it, and waited. A patient woman, in a warm and quiet place, holding something that was very nearly ripe. When the meal had been cleared, Greg stepped up onto the small stage and tapped a crystal glass with a silver spoon, and the room fell into a respectful hush. He looked out over the gathered town, and he let a practiced expression of solemn grief settle over his features. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice rich and warm. "My mother, Ruth Hayes, was the heart of this family and a pillar of this community." He spoke for several minutes, and it was a masterful performance. He spoke of his mother's strength and her grace. He spoke, with a catch in his throat, of the difficult final years, of the burden of caring for a failing parent, of the sacrifices that he, as the eldest, had felt duty-bound to make. He never once said Maggie's name. He painted, with broad and beautiful strokes, a portrait of himself as the devoted son who had quietly carried his family through its darkest hour. And the town, who knew nothing, nodded and dabbed at their eyes. "And now," Greg said, his voice lifting toward its triumphant conclusion, "I want to share with all of you how our family has decided to honor my mother's memory." He gestured, and a man in a sharp suit near the front inclined his head. "This is Mr. Holloway, of Ridgeline Development. After a great deal of soul-searching, our family has decided that the time has come to let the old Hayes orchard begin a new chapter. We will be entrusting that land to Ridgeline, who share our vision for the future of Millbrook. And with the proceeds, I am proud to announce the founding of the Hayes Family Foundation, dedicated to my mother's memory, which I will have the great honor of directing." He raised his glass. "To Ruth Hayes," he said. "To family. To legacy." The room rose in warm applause. Vivian beamed. Diane wiped away a perfectly composed tear. It was, in every way Greg had imagined it, the crowning moment of his life. It was at that exact moment that Maggie Hayes stood up. She did not rush. She rose from the small table at the back of the room, picked up her slim leather folder, and began to walk slowly up the center aisle, between the long ivory-draped tables, toward the stage and the portrait of her mother and her brother's triumphant smile. Heads turned as she passed. The applause faltered and died into a confused, rustling silence. Greg saw her coming, and a flicker of irritation crossed his face before he smoothed it into a thin, indulgent smile. "Ah," he said into the microphone, "my younger sister, Maggie." He spread his hands toward the crowd. "Many of you know that Maggie lived with our mother these past years and helped out around the house. We're all so grateful for that, Maggie, truly." He said it the way a man tosses a coin to a beggar. "But sweetheart," he added, lowering his voice into a tone of gentle condescension that carried perfectly across the silent room, "this really isn't the time. Why don't you go back and sit down, and we can talk later?" Maggie reached the foot of the stage. She looked up at her brother, and she did not sit down. Instead, she turned and faced the room, the whole gathered town of Millbrook, and when she spoke, her voice was calm and clear and carried to every corner of the barn. "I'm so glad everyone is here," she said. "Because before my brother sells this town a single acre of that orchard, all of you deserve to know who actually owns it." A murmur ran through the crowd. Greg's smile tightened. "Maggie," he warned. She did not even look at him. She opened her leather folder, withdrew a thick document bearing a notary's embossed seal, and held it up for the room to see. "This," she said, "is my mother's last will and testament. Signed by Ruth Hayes of her own free will, witnessed, and notarized, 8 months before she died. It revokes every prior will, and it leaves the entirety of her estate, including this orchard and the family home, to a single person, named as sole heir, sole executor, and sole trustee." She paused, and let the silence stretch. "That person is me." The murmur became a wave. Greg's face went pale beneath its careful tan. "That's a lie," he said, too loudly, leaning into the microphone. "That's a forgery. Mom's will, the real will, leaves the estate to Vivian and me. This is exactly the kind of desperate stunt I was afraid she'd pull." He appealed to the room, his voice climbing. "My sister is unwell. She manipulated a confused, dying woman. She's been after Mom's money for years." It was, Maggie would reflect later, almost magnificent, the way her brother accused her of his own exact crime. She let him finish. Then she pulled a second document from her folder. "This," she said, "is a letter from Dr. Abernathy, my mother's physician of 20 years, certifying that on the day she signed this will, Ruth Hayes was of completely sound mind, examined and witnessed." She let that settle, and then she turned her steady gaze on her brother. "The confused, manipulated will, Greg, is the one you filed. The one you and Vivian had a stranger notarize at the kitchen table while I was away, guiding our mother's hand because by then she could barely hold the pen." She looked back at the room. "I can prove every word of that. But I'm not finished, because owning the land is only the beginning of what you all need to hear tonight." She turned now to the man in the sharp suit near the front. "Mr. Holloway," she said. "Ridgeline Development." The man stiffened. "The letter of intent you are holding, the one you believe authorizes the sale of these 180 acres, bears my mother's signature. She withdrew a third document and held it up beside the first. But my mother never signed it. She never agreed to sell 1 inch of that orchard. That signature was forged, by my brother, on a contract to sell land he did not own. I'd think very carefully, Mr. Holloway, about how exposed your company is to a transaction built entirely on fraud. Holloway's face had gone gray. He set down his wine glass, leaned to murmur something urgent to the associate beside him, and the two of them began, very visibly, to put distance between themselves and Greg Hayes. And then Maggie reached into her folder and drew out a thick sheaf of papers, and she began to walk along the front tables, laying copies down in front of the mayor, the bankers, the men whose good opinion her brother had craved his whole life. While you all look at those, she said, her voice never rising, let me tell you what they show. For 3 years, my brother used a power of attorney. He tricked our mother into signing to drain her savings account. $240,000, routed through a shell company in his own name. My sister Vivian received regular payments from that same account. And 10 months ago, my brother forged our mother's signature again, on a $600,000 loan against this farm, money he poured into his failing business to keep his creditors at bay. She stopped walking and let the room absorb it. In this state, she said quietly, what they did has a name. It is called felony elder financial exploitation. Add the forgery and the bank fraud, and my brother and sister are looking at a great deal more than a lost inheritance. A woman near the front row had risen quietly from her seat and now stood near the stage, small and silver-haired and severe. This is Eleanor Cho, Maggie said. She is my attorney. As of Monday morning, the district attorney of this county will have certified copies of every document in your hands tonight. The barn had gone utterly silent now, save for the soft, oblivious playing of the string quartet, who had not been told to stop. Diane, Greg's wife, had sunk back into her chair, her hand drifting unconsciously to the diamond bracelet at her wrist. Maggie's eyes found her. That's a beautiful bracelet, Diane, she said. I hope it was worth it. Because it was bought with my mother's grocery money. Diane snatched her hand from her wrist as though the diamonds had turned to fire. And around her, the wives of Millbrook drew back, a slow, visible recoiling. An entire social world quietly closing its doors on the woman who had worn a dying woman's stolen money on her arm. Greg stood frozen on the stage, his coronation collapsing around him in real time. You have no proof, he said, but his voice had lost all its warmth and all its authority. It came out thin and desperate. You have no proof my mother wanted any of this. This is just you, twisting things, you bitter, jealous, pathetic woman, after the money you never earned a day in your life. And that was the moment Maggie Hayes had been waiting 9 years for. I have proof, Greg, she said softly. I have it in her own words. She looked toward the back of the room, where a young man from Eleanor's office stood beside the projector and the large screen Greg had set up to display his slideshow of carefully chosen family photographs. Maggie gave a small nod. The cheerful photos vanished from the screen. And in their place appeared the face of Ruth Hayes, sitting in her own kitchen in the warm morning light, alive again for 11 minutes, lucid and calm and absolutely certain. The whole town of Millbrook fell silent as a grave, and watched a dead woman speak. My name is Ruth Hayes, she said, her voice filling the great timber barn, and I am speaking of my own free will, with a clear mind. And then, gently and without anger, Ruth told them everything. The power of attorney her son had tricked her into signing. The money he had taken. The loan against her home she had never agreed to and never signed. The will they had guided her trembling hand to make, while her youngest daughter was away. She named it all, plainly, in front of the entire town, in her own kind and unbreakable voice. And then she came to the end. My daughter Margaret gave up 9 years of her life to take care of me, Ruth said, looking out from the screen at a room full of people who had spent those same 9 years calling Maggie a failure. She asked for nothing. The others called her a failure to my face, and God forgive me, for too many years I let them. Everything I have, I leave to Maggie. Not because she needs it. She does not need a penny of it, and one day you will all understand exactly what I mean by that. I leave it to her because she is the only one of my children who ever loved me as a person, and not as a bank. And then Ruth Hayes looked out across her own memorial, at the children who had robbed her, and she said the last words anyone in that barn would ever forget. The rest of you, she said, you reaped exactly what you sowed. The screen went dark. In the silence that followed, Lily Hayes was weeping openly. So were a good number of the people of Millbrook. Greg stood on the stage with his mouth open and no sound coming out, his face the color of ash, a man watching his entire life dissolve in his mother's own gentle voice. Vivian had collapsed into a chair, her practiced poise shattered, her hands over her face. And Maggie, standing quietly at the front of the room, was not finished. There was one thing left. The last and sweetest part of the fruit. You called me a freeloader, Greg, she said, into the ringing silence. For 9 years, all of you called me the failure. The one who never amounted to anything. The one who lived off our mother because she had nothing of her own. She paused. I want to tell you all something, because my mother said you would understand it one day, and I think that day is tonight. 3 years after I came home to care for our mother, I started a small business out of the old barn, selling preserves made from that orchard's fruit. I built it quietly, at night, after Mom was asleep. I never told any of you, because I had watched the 3 of you my whole life, and I knew exactly what you became when you smelled money. She let her gaze travel across her brother, her sister, the diamond-laden wife. That business is called Goldenrod Provisions, she said. Some of you have probably bought it at the market and never known. It is worth a little over $11 million. I own all of it. She let that land in the dead silence of the barn. I never needed a single dollar of our mother's money, she said. I was, this entire time, the wealthiest person in this family by far. I stayed because I loved her. That is the only reason I have ever done anything. You measured me by what you could take from me, and you never once stopped to wonder what I might actually be worth. The reversal moved through the room like a physical force. The pity that had followed Maggie up the aisle had turned. Completely and irreversibly, into something else, into a stunned and dawning respect, and beside it, aimed at the man frozen on the stage and the woman crumpled in her chair, a cold and growing contempt. The town of Millbrook was looking at Greg and Vivian Hayes and finally, clearly, seeing them. Maggie closed her leather folder. As the legal owner of that orchard and that house, she said, her voice steady and final, I'm asking both of you to be off my property by the end of the week. And as for the rest of it, that's no longer in my hands. It's in the hands of the district attorney now. She looked at her brother one last time, the golden boy, the devoted son, standing alone on his little stage beneath his mother's smiling portrait, with nothing left. You had 9 years to simply be kind, Greg, she said. You chose this. Then she turned her back on him, and she walked down the center aisle toward the door. And from the front of the room, 19-year-old Lily Hayes stood up, wiped her eyes, stepped past her stunned and silent father without a glance, and walked out of that barn at her aunt's side. On Monday morning, While the town of Millbrook was still buzzing with the story of what had happened in the Whitfield barn, Eleanor Cho walked into the county courthouse and filed everything. The real will. The trust. Dr. Abernathy's competency letter. Rosa Mendez's affidavit. And copies of every document detailing the theft, the forgery, and the fraud, which she walked across the street and delivered, in a neat banker's box, to the office of the district attorney. By the end of that single day, the careful architecture of Greg Hayes's life had begun to come apart at every seam at once. The forged will he had filed was thrown out, exposed by the notarized will that revoked it and the physician's letter that destroyed his claim that their mother had been confused. The court confirmed Maggie as the sole and rightful owner of the orchard and the farmhouse. The Ridgeline sale, built on a forged signature, collapsed entirely, and the company's lawyers, terrified of being dragged into a fraud prosecution, not only walked away but began drafting their own claims against Greg for the time and money they had sunk into a deal he had never had the right to make. The $600,000 loan he had forged against the farm unraveled next. And when the bank realized it had been holding a fraudulent document with a dead woman's faked signature, it had its own powerful reasons to cooperate quietly with the authorities rather than fight. And then, on a gray Thursday afternoon 2 weeks after the celebration, the district attorney filed charges. Gregory Hayes was arrested at the offices of his collapsing development company and charged with felony elder financial exploitation, multiple counts of forgery, and bank fraud. Vivian Hayes was charged as an accomplice for the money she had knowingly received and the will she had helped force into their mother's trembling hand. The golden son who had stood beneath his mother's portrait announcing his foundation and his legacy was now a man with a mug shot and a court date, his name printed in the local paper above the word fraud. His empire, which had always been more illusion than substance, did not so much collapse as evaporate. With the orchard sale dead, the forged loan exposed, and his accounts frozen pending the investigation, the creditors he had been holding off for years descended all at once. His development business filed for bankruptcy before the month was out. The leased German sedan was repossessed from the driveway of his expensive home, which the bank took next. The tailored suits and the smooth confidence had only ever been a costume stretched over a hollow frame, and now the costume was gone, and there was nothing underneath it but a frightened, ruined man. Diane did not wait around to share in any of it. The very week the charges were filed and the assets were frozen, Greg's wife filed for divorce. She had married a fortune, or the convincing performance of one, and she had no intention of standing beside a felon in a bankruptcy. She packed her things and moved back to her own family, and she took the diamond bracelet with her, though she found, when she tried to sell it, that no jeweler in the county wanted to touch a piece of jewelry that the whole town now knew had been bought with a dying woman's stolen grocery money. The diamonds that had caught the golden light so beautifully at the celebration became, in the end, a thing she could not even give away. Vivian's downfall was quieter, but in its way just as complete. Her interior design business had always depended on the good opinion of Millbrook's wealthy families, and that good opinion vanished overnight. No one wanted the woman who had robbed her own mother decorating their dining room. Her clients cancelled. Her invitations stopped. The social world she had floated through like visiting royalty closed its doors in her face, one by one, until there was nowhere left for her to go. And it was then, when she had finally run out of everything else, that Vivian came to find her sister. She came to the farmhouse on a cold afternoon, a few weeks before the trial, and she found Maggie out in the orchard, pruning the apple trees in her father's old flannel shirt. Vivian picked her way across the frozen ground in shoes entirely wrong for it, and she stood at the edge of the field, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Vivian's composure broke, and the tears came, and they were, for once, probably real. "Maggie, please," she said. "I'm ruined. Everything's gone. My business, my friends, everything. They're talking about prison, Maggie. Actual prison. You're the only one who can stop this now. You could talk to the district attorney. You could tell them you don't want to press the charges, that it was all a family misunderstanding. We're sisters, Maggie. Whatever Greg did, whatever I did, we're still blood. You can't just throw your own family away." Maggie set down her pruning shears and looked at her sister for a long, quiet moment. There was no anger in her face, and there was no triumph either. There was only a kind of tired, final clarity. "Do you know what a sapodilla is, Vivian?" she asked. Her sister stared at her, uncomprehending. "Of course you don't," Maggie said gently. "It's a fruit. Grandma planted the trees, down at the far end. It has a plain, ugly brown skin, and if you bite into it too early, before it's ready, it's so bitter it makes your whole mouth go numb. Most people taste that once and decide they know everything about it, and they throw it in the dirt and never touch it again." She picked up her shears again. "That's what you did to me," she said. "All three of you. You bit down early, you tasted nothing but your own impatience, and you threw me away. For 9 years. And now you're standing in my orchard telling me about blood." She turned back to the tree. "You and Greg reached into our mother's hand while she was dying and used it to rob her and to erase me," she said. "That isn't a misunderstanding, Vivian. It's the truest thing the two of you ever did. I'm not going to talk to the district attorney. What happens now isn't my choice. It's the harvest of the seeds you planted. I'd suggest you find a good lawyer." And then she went back to her pruning, and after a while, Vivian gave up and picked her way back across the frozen field, and drove away, and that was the last real conversation the two sisters ever had. Greg came too, in the end, the week before his trial. Maggie agreed to meet him exactly once, at a diner on the edge of town, neutral ground, with Eleanor Cho's blessing and a recording device in her coat pocket, just in case. The man who slid into the booth across from her bore almost no resemblance to the golden son who had stood beneath their mother's portrait. He had lost weight. His clothes were ordinary now, off the rack, a little rumpled. His hands shook slightly as they wrapped around the coffee mug. For a few minutes he tried the old approach, the charm, the condescension, talking to her as though he could still manage her, still arrange her, still tell her where to sit. But it had no power left, and somewhere in the middle of it he seemed to realize that, and the performance simply ran out. "I'm going to lose everything, Maggie," he said finally, his voice low. "The business is gone. Diane's gone. Lily won't return my calls. They're going to put me in a cell." He looked up at her, and his eyes were wet, and whether the tears were for their mother or only for himself, Maggie could not tell, and found she no longer cared. "You're my sister," he said. "You could end this. One word from you and the DA backs off the worst of it. I made mistakes. I know I made mistakes. But you don't throw away your own brother over money." Maggie looked at him across the cracked diner table, this man she had once, as a little girl, looked up to. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "It was never about the money. I had more money than all of you, the entire time. I never wanted $1 of Mom's." She wrapped her own hands around her coffee mug. "You want to know what it was actually about, Greg," she said. "It was about the fact that for 9 years, I sat with our mother every single day. I fed her and bathed her and held her hand when she was frightened in the night. And you couldn't even be bothered to visit, except to figure out how much she was worth dead." She paused. "You called that love a failure. You stood up in front of the whole town and pretended you were the one who carried this family, while I was the one who actually did it, in the dark, where none of you bothered to look. And then you tried to steal the last thing she had and erase me from her life with a forged piece of paper." She stood up and put a few dollars on the table for the coffee. "Some fruit goes bitter, Greg," she said, looking down at her broken brother, "and once it does, no amount of waiting ever brings the sweetness back. You had 9 years. You spent every one of them deciding I was nothing." She picked up her keys. "I hope, wherever you end up, you finally have the time to understand what you threw into the dirt." And then she walked out of the diner and into the cold, clean air, and she did not look back, and she left her brother sitting alone with the consequences he had spent his whole life planting. Greg Hayes avoided a long prison sentence only by pleading guilty to spare himself a trial. And in exchange he was ordered to pay back every dollar he had stolen, a debt that would shadow him for the rest of his diminished life. On top of the ruin his own choices had already made of it. Vivian, too, took a plea, and lost what little she had left. The golden children of the Hayes family, who had spent their whole lives being admired, would spend the rest of it being remembered, by everyone in Millbrook, as the two who robbed their dying mother. They had reaped, exactly and precisely, the bitter crop they had spent 9 years sowing. With the orchard saved and the courts behind her, Maggie Hayes did something her brother and sister could never have understood. She stopped hiding. For 9 years she had kept Goldenrod Provisions a secret. Run from the shadows of an old barn under the name of a faceless holding company. Because she had been afraid of exactly the kind of greed she had finally watched destroy her own family. But there was nothing left to be afraid of now. The worst had already happened, and she had walked through it, and she had come out the other side still herself. So she brought her business home, fully and openly, into the light. She moved back into the crooked white farmhouse, the house where she had been born, the house she now truly owned, and she set about healing it. She repaired the things her brother and sister had let fall into disrepair in their rush to sell. She fixed the sagging porch where she and her mother had sat through so many autumn afternoons. And in the old barn. The same barn where she had once filled jars by lamplight after her mother fell asleep. She built a proper production facility for Goldenrod Provisions, gleaming and modern, but still smelling of apples and cinnamon and the orchard just outside the doors. And then she did the thing that told everyone in Millbrook exactly what kind of woman she was, the thing that drew the sharpest possible line between her and the family she had come from. She started hiring. She brought jobs to a town that needed them, good jobs, with fair wages and dignity, and she did not hold grudges in the hiring. Some of the people who came to work for her were people who had, in years past, smiled along when her family called her a failure, who had looked right through the quiet woman at the back of the room. Maggie hired them anyway, the ones who were willing to work honestly, because she had learned from her mother, and not from the rest of them, what a person is actually for. She was not interested in revenge against people who had only been thoughtless. She had already given the ones who had been cruel exactly what they had earned. To everyone else, she offered something her family never had. A chance. The story of what had happened, of the freeloader who turned out to be the secret millionaire, of the dying mother's video and the golden sun's fall, swept through the region and well beyond it. And as these things sometimes do, it found its way to Goldenrod Provisions itself. People who had never heard of the little brand suddenly wanted to buy a jar of preserves made by the woman who had loved her mother for 9 years while her family circled like crows. Orders poured in from all across the country, The business, already worth more than her whole family combined, grew larger still. But Maggie did not change. She still drove the old pickup truck. She still wore her father's flannel shirts out among the trees. The money had never been the point. It had only ever been the proof of something the world had refused to see. She was not alone in any of it. The family she had been born into had shattered, but in its place, slowly and warmly, another kind of family gathered around her. Rosa Mendez, the fierce, kind nurse who had cared for Ruth and stood as a witness to her truth, became one of Maggie's closest friends. And eventually came to help run the farm's day-to-day life, the two of them moving through the old house with an easy, comfortable affection. Eleanor Cho, who had walked into battle beside her, stayed in her life long after the legal work was done, the two women bound by the strange intimacy of people who have fought a war together. And Lily, the niece who had stood up in that barn and walked out at her aunt's side, came to live at the orchard. She had been quietly disowned by what remained of her own broken parents, but she found at the farm something far better than what she had lost. She learned the business from the ground up, she learned the orchard season by season, and she became, in every way that actually mattered, the daughter Maggie had never had. There were hard days, of course. There were mornings when Maggie walked out among the trees and the grief for her mother rose up so suddenly and so completely that she had to stop and put her hand against a trunk to steady herself. She missed Ruth with a depth that the people who had only seen her mother as a bank account would never be capable of feeling. She kept her mother's photograph in the kitchen, in the warm morning light where the video had been filmed. She kept the recipe, her grandmother's recipe and her mother's recipe, at the very heart of everything Goldenrod made, so that in a strange and beautiful way, her mother's hands were in every jar that left the farm. And on Sunday afternoons she would drive out to the small cemetery on the hill and sit beside the grave and tell her mother about the orchard, about the harvest, about Lily, about all of it. "You were right, Mom," she would say. The sweetness kept. 2 autumns after the night in the Whitfield barn. The orchard was heavy with fruit again, and Maggie Hayes stood at the far end of it. Beneath the old Sapodilla trees her grandmother had planted, with a basket on her hip and the late afternoon sun turning everything to gold. The harvest was coming in. In the barn behind her, the production line hummed, filling jars with the honey-dark preserves that now traveled to kitchens all across the country. Rosa was calling something cheerful from the porch. Lily was somewhere among the apple rows, laughing with one of the seasonal workers. The whole farm breathed with a warmth and a life it had not known in years, the warmth of a place where people are valued for who they are and not for what can be taken from them. Of the family she had come from, there was little left to say. Greg lived in a small rented apartment in another town now. Working an ordinary job, sending a portion of every paycheck toward a debt of restitution he would likely never finish paying. His name a quiet cautionary tale in the place where he had once been a king. Vivian had moved away entirely, somewhere no one knew her story, to begin again with nothing. Maggie did not hate them. She had passed beyond hatred a long time ago, somewhere on the far side of that microphone. When she thought of them at all, which was not often, she felt only a distant, quiet sorrow. The way you might feel looking at fruit that had fallen too early and rotted in the grass, fruit that might have been sweet, if only it had been willing to wait. They had held, in their own hands, a sister who loved her mother, an orchard their family had tended for generations, and the chance to simply be good. And they had thrown all of it into the dirt, chasing a fortune, never once realizing that the truest fortune had been standing quietly among them the entire time. Maggie reached up into the branches and pressed her thumb, gently, against one of the small, plain, rough brown sapodillas hanging there. It gave, just slightly, soft and ready beneath its homely skin. She smiled, and she picked it, and she added it to her basket. It was ripe. It had taken its own time, in its own quiet way, exactly as it was always meant to. And it was, she knew without even tasting it, sweeter than anything those who had thrown it away could ever have imagined. That is where Maggie's story comes to rest, my friends. But the lesson living inside it is one I want you to carry with you, the same way I carry this basket of fruit in from the orchard each morning. The world is full of people who will judge you, as Maggie's family judged her, by nothing more than your plain brown skin. They will see a quiet life and decide it is a small one. They will see soft hands offered in love and call them the hands of a failure. They will bite down on you in their impatience, taste nothing but their own assumptions, and throw you in the dirt, certain they know exactly what you are. And here is what I want you to remember on the days when that happens. They are not tasting you. They are only tasting their own haste. The sweetness you carry inside you does not disappear because someone refused to wait for it. It simply waits for someone who will. Do not let the people who only value you for what they can take from you ever convince you of your own worth. Keep your receipts, yes, as Maggie did, because the world is hard and the evidence will protect you. But more than that, keep your heart. Keep loving the people who deserve it, the way Maggie loved her mother, even when the loud ones around you call that love a waste. Because one day, in its own time, the harvest always comes. And the soil keeps an honest ledger. You truly cannot plant cruelty and greed and expect to gather loyalty and love. You reap, every single one of us, exactly what we sow. So before you go tonight, let me leave you with one last question, and please, tell me your answer down in the comments. Do you think Maggie was too harsh with her brother and her sister, when they came to her begging? Or do you think they simply harvested the bitter fruit they had spent 9 long years planting? I read every single comment, so tell me what you believe. And while you are there, tell me this too. In your own family, who is the quiet one, the one who stays, the one who does the caring while the loud ones take the credit? Maybe it is someone you love. Maybe, just maybe, it is you. Tell me your story, and tell me what corner of the world you are listening from tonight, because it warms my heart to know how far these stories travel. If this one touched you, if you have ever been the sapodilla that someone threw away too soon, then do me a small kindness. Leave a like, so that more people who need this story can find it. Subscribe and stay close, because there is always another basket waiting to be filled, and another quiet morning here among the trees. Take gentle care of yourselves, and of the quiet ones around you. And I will see you on the next one.